you and your families are safe and healthy as we face this global health crisis, which has already affected more than 1.8 million people as of today worldwide, with close to 300,000 of these confirmed cases in Asia. Not a good picture, of course, no, but as an ECD community, we stand strong in advocating for the need to address the well-being of young children and their families, especially those in vulnerable situations. I am pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is the first in a series of webinars we will be having on young children amidst COVID-19. We offer this series of webinars so that as a regional ECD community, we can have a platform to discuss and share our concerns on how this pandemic is affecting the young children. In the process, we learn from the creative and innovative solutions each one of you are implementing in your respective countries. In today's webinar, we are focusing on the most disadvantaged young children and their families at a time when governments enforce strict measures to stop the spread of the coronavirus and what we might learn from parents implementing practical ECD strategies. And we will be focusing our webinar for today in terms of addressing the needs of young children with special needs, children of migrant workers in urban centers, and children in ethnic, rural, peri-urban, and urban communities. We have close to 400 registrants from 40 countries. Thank you for this overwhelming response, which shows that the interest and the demand for this kind of discussions. Again, to our attendees, for those who have just joined, please introduce yourselves by typing your name in the chat box and state which organization and country do you come from. Please select all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your name and where you come from. We hope that this webinar will provide you with some practical insights which you can take with you as you design and redesign some of your ECD programs to respond to this global pandemic. As to the flow of the session, we have 4 speakers for today. So you can see in your screen, I have asked all our presenters to turn on their videos so you can see them. We will hear first from Dr. Sheldon Schaefer, Chair of the ARNEC Board of Directors. He will have 15 minutes presentation and 5 minutes for Q&A. Followed by Dr. Yvonne Betcher, Chief Executive of Child Development Center in Hong Kong, another 10 minutes. And then we'll go to Sumitra Mishra, Executive Director of Mobile Crushes India. She will also have 10 minutes. And the last presentation will be made by our colleagues from Save the Children Philippines, Joy Sampang and Catherine Manzano. And after all the presentations, we will devote 15 minutes for Q&A, and the last 5 minutes will be devoted for some ARNEC, for some updates from ARNEC. All right, so the first presentation will be done by Dr. Sheldon Schaefer. So Sheldon will provide his perspectives on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on young children and their families, particularly how this might reinforce or worsen factors which tend to exclude young children and families from access to quality ECD programs. Let's listen to Sheldon. Sheldon, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed by the management of this by ARNEC and of course by the 400 people who've registered. That just indicates the importance that many people feel about this topic. The virus is a real emergency, actually, not only for all of us, but especially for the lives of young children, which are being seriously disrupted. UNESCO estimated, and this is now about 2 weeks ago, that there were 1.5 billion children, including in pre-primary and higher education, who were out of school, or 87% of the school-going population. Most estimates, if you look at articles coming out on the impact, in fact, don't look at early childhood or pre-primary programs. So it's important at the country level to make sure that one is looking at the statistics and data about those who are out of ECD programs in pre-primary. It's not usually done. 180 countries have had school closures for weeks, for months. In Thailand, they've just postponed the opening until July 1, which is about 6 weeks later than it should be. Many other countries are doing the same thing. So the COVID-19 will have a long-term and far-reaching impact, especially on vulnerable, disadvantaged families and children. And part of this that we'll be looking at here is that because of this impact, disparities, exclusion, and inequities will increase. And that is the problem. Next, please. So the impact is greater on children already facing challenges of schooling and learning. And we'll be looking at each of these later on. Children with delays and disabilities, children living in poverty, children living in remote and rural areas, children not fluent in the national language of instruction, children of refugees and of migrant families. Next, please. Next. First, with delays and disabilities. Well, these children, one, they will no longer have access to early learning services that they've had access to in the past, which would have had a set routine, perhaps teachers trained in disability, inclusive education, special education. They might have had therapy, assistance of other teachers, and a curriculum adapted. They will no longer have access to this in many cases. They may not also have access to distance learning, which is meant to replace their attendance at schools and ECD centers. And they won't have access to online courses adapted to their needs, whether it's sight impaired, hearing impaired, or others. They may live in families unable to provide needed special services. The families haven't had these children necessarily for full days before. They've been in other programs, so they might lack the skills and also, of course, the patience to do so. These children will also lose important interaction with other children, which they've had. This kind of interaction is especially important with other children with disabilities, but also with their able peers, and that now is lost. They will therefore, in summary, lose a strong, close-knit network of people who have been supporting them, and they're often multiple and complex needs. Next, please. Children living in poverty, well, they're more often in crowded urban contexts, which might have weak medical systems, even weaker than the national system perhaps. More air pollution. We know now from recent research that air pollution has a strong impact on the physical but also brain development of children. This will lead, in fact, to the greater likelihood of infection and illness. They will no longer have their ECD program or school as a place of sanctuary, which they might have found in difficult families, but also as a place that can make up for the social and economic disadvantage of their families. These families might have few books, less educated caregivers, and in fact now a more stressful learning environment. They will no longer benefit from non-academic programs that used to be attached to ECD programs and primary schools, such as health services, feeding and nutritional supplementation programs, etc. And they will likely not have adequate technological resources, computers, internet services, which are required in many cases for online learning. I've just seen a study from Pakistan where there are 47 million children now out of school who likely do not have access to any kind of virtual learning. Elite private schools do, public schools, especially poor ones, do not. So this result is that the digital divide between rich and poor will only increase. Next, please. Children living in remote and rural villages, well, they will also suffer from the digital divide, not only because of poverty, which they're probably in, but also the lack of connectivity and access to online learning. They're simply not able to connect as more urban children are able to do. They're going to be less able to benefit from social interaction. Many of them are in remote villages and remote houses, and they were able to get some kind of social interaction from their ECD programs in schools, and their mothers as well in many cases. This will no longer be possible. And if there still are programs available to them, there will likely be much less money available to these schools and programs to mitigate against the various disadvantages they always face. They will end up with fewer materials, there'll be fewer subsidies, trained teachers, cost of transportation will not be subsidized, etc. So they might be in school, but they'll still be disadvantaged. Children not using the language of instruction at the home. Well, there are two contexts here. In the context where early learning is actually provided in their home language or their mother tongue, they will no longer be exposed to mother tongue-based multilingual education and to the benefit it provides. I would assume that most of the online materials that are coming out of central ministries in many cases are again in national language. So any kind of curriculum adaptations made in terms of mother tongue based multilingual education will no longer be available to them. In the other context where children are learning in the national language and not the mother tongue, even in early childhood programs, but especially in primary schools, they will lose this opportunity to master the national language in a more structured setting. In comparison to children who are speaking at home the national language, they will fall further behind. Next, please. Now, children of migrant and refugee families, well, they may be forced to live in crowded migrant areas, quarantine camps of various kinds, therefore, again, more susceptible to infection and illness. They may face discrimination and stigma, especially if they are returning from a place, a city or another country, with COVID-19 infection. They again may have less access to technology. If they're returning to villages with their parents, in other words, they've been in the cities with their parents, they will face this interruption in their education and learning. The routine they had established, however poor it might be in quality in the city, is now going to be interrupted by their return back to the village. On the other hand, if they've actually been left behind by migrant parents, the parents have migrated seasonally or a longer period of time, leaving the children behind with extended family, especially grandparents, they may find that their home environment is in fact complicated by their parents' return. Unemployed, poor, crowded in a house, lockdown situation, this may in fact lead to an increase in domestic violence and also violence against children. One reads often in the UK and Indonesia and elsewhere, considerable increase in domestic violence as noted in emergency lines, 911 lines. This is going to be in fact a major problem. And they may find also that their parents are not familiar with the curriculum and its language. The children go off to a school, the migrant parents, many of whom might be just returning, don't understand the curriculum or even the language that is being used, which would make home language more difficult. Next, please. Now, there are other important, more cross-cutting issues, I suppose. One is that children lose important social interaction, children of whatever kind, with others. And this is accompanied by the trauma and the psychological damage, again, caused by perhaps increasing poverty, the lockdown, the isolation that they feel. Virtual learning, if they have it, is really no substitute for group play and stimulation. Extensive screen time, whether it's from online learning or games, can have negative effects on the social skills, self-regulation, and attention spans. So if they're out of this context for several months, it's going to have a serious impact. Communities also lose empathy for others and get fearful of outsiders. Stigma and stress increase. One reads about nurses and doctors in the front line working in hospitals being evicted from their apartment buildings, not allowed to return back to their homes because of the stigma attached to them and the fear of their neighbors that they might be infected. Asians, as we know around the world, are being seen as all Chinese and therefore also to be blamed for the virus. So less empathy, greater stigma. Domestic violence, as I said, is going to be likely to increase. Lockdowns, greater poverty. This will make, in fact, the home environments more toxic for children because of the violence and the poverty, and this will have impact on their health and, as we know, their brain development. And also budgets of ministries involved in ECD might be diverted to combat the pandemic. In Thailand, 10% of every ministry budget is being taken out to fight the pandemic in some way. Extra subsidies for the unemployed, small business enterprise loans, but ministries are losing their funds. Even within the health ministry, funds might be diverted from other health needs of young children into fighting the pandemic. One argues it's important, but it's again going to have an impact on children. So what can be done? Well, there are many things, and we'll hear about them, more of them in the presentations that follow. One is to somehow ensure that the feeding programs, the nutritional supplementation, the family subsidies like conditional cash transfers are continued. How do we do that? How do we make sure that in the special budgets that are being prepared by governments to combat the pandemic, that they continue to put money into these education programs and also services in mother tongues? How do we ensure that continues? How do we ensure that there is special assistance continuing to children with disabilities, whether it's home visits, if that's still possible, from social workers and disability inclusive teachers, special needs teachers, whether it's adapted online materials? What has to be done to ensure that children with delays and disabilities don't get farther behind? Low tech and no tech solutions to distance learning, printed materials, home learning kits that go out to families about learning games and other kinds of things, or radio and TV as low tech rather than computers. Family support services to meet demands for distance online learning. Again, this depends on whether people from schools and others can actually still continue to visit homes and assist with this, but some kind of service to help parents and children to understand and use the distance online learning, which is available if it is, but also support services to combat the risks of domestic violence. And finally, future strategies for what happens next. Schools come back, children have lost dozens of contact hours, if not hundreds. They might have lost a large part of the year's curriculum, even with online learning. How do they catch up? Holidays are canceled, as will be the case in Thailand. But also, how do we look at strategies to overcome the disparities from the impact of the pandemic? We know the disparities are happening. How do we plan now to help overcome them? And here I think school leaders are important. One reads very little in the literature about what school leaders, principals, and head teachers can do in this regard, and I think that's important. Now, one ends maybe on a positive note. What are they? Well, there's going to be a new normal. I was listening this morning to economists talking about the economic situation won't really be back to where it used to be until another year or so from now, and the same might be in terms of the education sector. So how do we use this as an opportunity at all to do better the next time in terms of organizing and managing education and ECD sectors? How do we enhance the curriculum in the future to include skills and behaviors, values, and other kinds of things meant to look more at resilience and coping with stress? Parents are now more involved, for good or bad, one can argue, but how do we recognize the fact that they have been more involved and build on this for more engagement in the future, more educated, useful engagement in the future? How do we ensure that there is better and more inclusive access to and the use of technology in learning and education? We know it's happening. We know it has positive effects and negative effects. How do we make sure that in the future, any discussion around technology and education is going to be looking more at this issue of the digital divide? And finally, how do we use this as an opportunity to invest in preparedness for the next emergency or pandemic? And there will be one. Whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's conflict, or whether it's a pandemic, these are going to happen. And we have to be better prepared for them, family and community level, but also, as we know now, at the government level. And we just haven't done that. So thank you. I think the main message is that there will be a serious impact on young children, especially on disadvantaged and vulnerable, excluded populations. And how do we focus on that, and overcoming those additional exclusions is going to be important for all of us in the ECD community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. Thank you, Sheldon, for that insightful presentation. And again, a reminder that this pandemic will really have a long-term and far-reaching impact on our disadvantaged families and children. And I'm sure some of the issues that you've touched on will be able to unpack as we hear presentations from the countries. Meanwhile, we have some time to respond to questions. Maybe we will take 2 questions, and I'd like to start with a question, Sheldon, that was sent to us as part of the registration process. So there's a question which I think is very relevant, and here it is. Do you know of some policy measures introduced by any government in the region to address the impact of COVID-19 on the vulnerable population? policy measures?
Yes, I mean, this is a problem. The initial kind of knee-jerk reaction is to close schools and send children home and lock them down. I mean, that's a government measure to combat the pandemic itself. What has not happened, I think, in general, is the government's attention to the impact of this school closure on, as I say, the most disadvantaged children and the most disadvantaged families. There are programs I've heard of where you actually try to overcome the disparity, increasing disparities of delays and disabilities where you can, by having the special needs teachers still able to go to homes and actually provide guidance to the families and to the children. You have cases, in fact, where you have continuation of subsidies, looking not only, as I say, of financial needs, small businesses and unemployed workers now, but also continuing the special subsidies that are going to families in various ways. There is this issue of technology. There are mayors in cities around the world, especially in America, who are saying, if someone has no access to technology, then no one will have access to technology. So they're actually not allowing online courses because they know if they do, it's going to impact especially on those who are disadvantaged and vulnerable. I haven't seen that happening here yet, but I think it is going to be important that governments start looking at this issue more deeply about the anticipated but also unanticipated impact of the reaction to the pandemic on young children.
Thank you, Sheldon. And we have some more questions coming in our Q&A chat box. If I may just read out a question from Sam Sternin. Many governments across Asia are now preparing economic response plans and budgets. Other groups are very organized to defend their economic interests and secure earmarked funds, subsidy support. What should be the key ask of the ECD community in economic stimulus plans and policies?
Well, they have to make sure. Yes, they have to make sure, as I said, that some of the stimulus is going to, first of all, families and unemployed workers. There's a contrast in Thailand and other countries I've seen in the region where, in some countries, most of the money is going towards businesses. Could be small businesses, big businesses. And in other cases, there are actually subsidies going to unemployed workers, increases in the social insurance available, special subsidies. In Thailand, there were going to be funds available, 5,000 baht per person for several months. 3 million were expected, 9 million applied. And the government has found money in some way or another to make that possible. So I think we have to keep insisting as the ECD community that when governments make up their budgets for the response to the pandemic, that they're looking not only at the impact on businesses and what they need, but also families, and especially the most disadvantaged families, so that these disparities don't in fact increase.
Thank you, Sheldon. So there are other questions, but I think some of these questions are better answered after the presentation of the of the other presenters. So we'll go now to the next presenter. So our second presenter is Yvonne, Dr. Yvonne Becher, the Chief Executive of Child Development Center in Hong Kong. She will share with us their experience in serving young children with special needs and their families amid COVID-19. Over to you, Yvonne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
Yvonne, please.
Thank you. Okay. Just a quick introduction to the Child Development Center here in Hong Kong, where we focus on the preschool age children, predominantly underage, but we do have some counseling services for up to 12 and assessments up to 16. And it's all evolving around giving services to the children with special needs, predominantly center-based, but also some home-based and some community outreach programs. But we also give parenting support and early screening. That's on a normal day basis, you know, when things are kind of normal. We serve about 450 families per year, and we are partially government subvented. And the other side, of course, is self-financed. And delivering all the services is a multidisciplinary team of about 40 staff, and including admin and support staff. So I'm drawing some of those experiences we've had for the last 10 weeks, where Hong Kong is not in complete lockdown, but centers have been closed, except for centers like ours, where we've been given the discretion to deliver services as we see fit, except for the demand to close group programs. So I get to that later, but the challenges we've seen specifically in these circumstances for the SEN population are for the children, with SEN that, keep in mind, are typically young children who are lively, active, not always wheelchair bound, not that kind of stereotype. So we find that given with the SEN population, they have a more fragile immune system, and that puts them at more risk, of course, of catching the virus, and we are quite mindful of that. At the same time, they can be more impulsive, so a lot of more touching, again, more opportunity to touch surfaces where the virus is maybe hiding, we don't know. So again, higher risk of getting infected. And with that, the delay in development comes, of course, communication issues of getting across what's important at the moment. That's a change in lifestyle, all this sort of thing, or, for example, extended mouthing periods, again, with, things going into the mouth more often than you would expect for the typical population. The change in routine is certainly something we've encountered as a challenge, especially for the young children with autism. They most affected by this sudden change in routine, and again, on top of that, the lack of communication, the understanding of why things are happening needs to be conveyed in a different way. And then they do rely on adult help longer and sometimes more physical help. Again, that increases the risk for cross-infection we have to be mindful of. And one thing that I think is driving us all is this is the early intervention period. This is so crucial for any child or person with special needs. And we know that even a short closure after a school holiday can have an impact on their ongoing development. So it's crucial that we have ongoing therapy. So based on these issues, we've come up with some ideas at our center that I will try to generalize. So for example, we want to continue the services safely. That's the first strategy. Like I said, we had to close all school group programs, and we quickly had to swiftly change to an individual sessions only, home-based or center-based, and home activities delivery mode. And it's all at parents' discretion. So the parents, like Sheldon was mentioning, have become greater partners in saying how much they want their child to be exposed. And on an organizational point of view, a part is that we needed to rewrite our schedules very quickly. We needed to get all staff on site. Everybody who suddenly had group programs needed to be changed to individual delivery. The toy cleaning was impacted. Everybody had to be on site. We had to inform parents very quickly, get them on site. That in itself has challenges. We can't rely all on email. We have some families that don't have emails, so we did phone calls, many more phone calls, and we developed infographics that either went out by hand on our door or via email, whatever we found was appropriate. And we very quickly had to organize those new sessions into something that was kind of a schedule, a new schedule. So it's all evolved around good communication on all levels with all stakeholders. On that, on a more micro level, I think the safety is crucial, and it all evolves around the hygiene procedures to protect the children, protect the families, the staff, and the community. So all this hand washing, the temperature taking, the masks, that can be introduced. There are some challenges, especially children who are more sensitive or sensory sensitive. They don't wear the masks. We have to say no more high fives, or the physical prompting, the physical praise, has to be translated, and new ways of delivering those have to be come up. Of course, the extra cleaning, the extra is essential, but we also have a mandate we put on ourselves. We say no more than 3 children in the center, and they all have to be in different rooms. So no touch, no contact. The extra cleaning is a given. And if it turns out the staff don't see any children on that day, then they can do their admin work from home on a home rotation. And that's also to keep the staff safe. I think that's an important way of making sure the delivery of services can continue. If you don't have the staff, then everything else falls apart. And you keep adjusting. Over the last 10 weeks, we've continuously updated and kept adjusting. Another level is the families who don't opt or cannot come to the individual services. I think they still need, of course, some kind of input. And I think one good way of doing that is home activity programs. We deliver it through email, but I know that it could be also done like through little activity packs that can be delivered literally physically to their doorsteps of a family. Because even with our home programs, we individualize them as much as possible, which is a good side, but they're not always accessible to the local families, although they're accessible worldwide. Some families have moved on beyond Hong Kong, and they appreciate, oh, we can still get the home program, great, but even local families we know who don't have access to email and internet, we have to come up with different modes of still making sure that they get that. That's a minimum that we are trying to achieve. But to Sheldon's point, we don't know how much they're taken up at home and implemented. The parents' availability is sometimes limited. They are still working from home. They don't know, how to fit it into their routine. And their ability varies, because that's why they come to our center with the experts to deliver. But we're trying to teach them and encourage them to do as much as they can. We also support the parents by having established parent support groups and literally giving out resources like masks or sanitizers and handouts that keeps them physically safe. In addition to WhatsApp group, we decided to WhatsApp, that's very popular here, but any kind of means of support that you can connect and keep the parents' anxiety down and encourage them at the same time would be great. Online sessions, we've been asked many times, how about online sessions? We don't work with that a lot because it doesn't work for the very young age group. It still needs an adult on the other side of the sessions for our young population. And it works only for some slightly older age groups. That's what we feel. And again, we want to limit screen time. We don't want to over bombard, but of course we do use it in a limited sense. But in the current situation, we don't rely as the direct mode of delivery. Hence our home program, that we hope that the parents can implement. So the results are that we have an uptake of individual sessions, that the center is still open, say, if you want to come, please let us know. And about 20% have taken it up. That is kind of an average representative sample across Hong Kong when we contacted other centers. So that's an interesting 1/5 of the population feels safe and able to still come and take benefit from the individual sessions. The home activities, we don't know how parents have responded. We just keep delivering them once a week. A new activity pops up, and we are rekindling. So we just closed for Easter, and we're rekindling our open programs as of this Thursday, and that's when we're hoping to get some data on also, make contact again on that particular point with the parents, say, how much have you been using this home program activity stuff? So the data will be coming in the next few weeks, we hope, on that. The parent support group, again, it's a select few who pick it up, but it's over there, and I think it's growing. More and more parents are beginning to feel they do want the support on any kind of level, their own anxiety, how to keep their children, occupied and stimulated in an appropriate way. The withdrawals are coming in, but the parents have growing concern for therapy input. So we have learned some lessons. We do inform the parents, we support the parents, but we can't bombard them. They are still adjusting, working and coping. Some, I feel, have COVID-19 fatigue to a certain extent, right? They're just saying, we're just hanging in there, don't give us more to do, in a way. There are the other groups of parents, who want more and more and more. So you need to listen to the individual. We learn we can't please everybody in that environment, but we're empathetic to everybody and keep reassuring families and staff how to go on and keep going, and you're doing the best you can, even if it's a minimal thing you do. The new routines that are established are there. They will change continuously, so we need to stay flexible, and we continue to keep adjusting on all levels. So we do fee adjustments, we do service mode adjustments. It's unfortunately still ongoing, the adjustment. So we've taken the threat that, the threat that children need ongoing therapy as a motivation we've turned it around, I think. We want to see children still get the ongoing therapy that they deserve and need. And sort of the pledge is there for everybody to take up, to continue to serve the children with special needs and their families, as long as it's a safe, hopefully individual needs based and supportive to all the stakeholders. That's the families and the children, and I include the staff as well. So that's sort of just a quick overview of on that note for the children with special needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. And there are already questions coming in related to your presentation, but we'll finish with all the other presentations before we take, some of the questions. Thank you for that. The Executive Director of Mobile Creches India, Ms. Sumitra Mishra. She will be covering the challenges faced by migrant workers and their young children during this COVID-19 situation, and how her organization, Mobile Creches, together with other agencies in India, are trying to respond to the issue. So let's listen to Sumitra. Sumitra, over to you.
So I'll speak from the experience of mobile creches over the last 2 weeks since the pandemic broke out. Mobile creches, as you know, works with the very young children from the most vulnerable communities, mostly young children of women working in the unorganized sector. We reach on an average annually to around 15,000 such young children through our creches and daycare programs. Over the last 2 weeks, the focus has been on primarily the migrant families. According to ILO, 400 million workers in the unorganized sector, and over the last 2 weeks since the lockdown was announced, roughly government estimates say that there's been almost 1 million migrant families who've been trying to travel from the cities back home, except that they reached nowhere, caught between their homes in the cities and in the villages, in shelters and camps, in very difficult circumstances where survival was a much bigger issue for them. Dying out of hunger was a far bigger fear than dying out of the coronavirus. Millions are trapped either at cities or centers in packed urban slums. Sheldon mentioned some of those situations. I will not go into it in detail. We expect, roughly looking at the government data, that this pandemic currently is affecting around 56 million children under 6 years of age across the country, living in very, very fragile ecosystems. What have we been doing, and what are some of the lessons that we've learned that we can share with everyone? I think the first thing that we did was to reach out directly to our communities. That has been a predominant factor, and please remember that some of these communities are at construction sites, at waste pickle dumps, slums around out in the outskirts of the cities, and within the cities as well, where families work in very, very vulnerable occupations, domestic work, waste picking, street vending, and stuff like that, who have completely lost their livelihoods. In that kind of a situation, our first instinct was to reach out and just trace and track our families, to reassure them to stay where they were, and to ensure that they are getting the required help that they needed. The other thing that we focused on is collaborations with a big C. As things changed on almost on an hour basis, and we were all trying to deal with the situation 2 weeks earlier, staying in touch with people from the government, people from local administration, other civil society organizations, industries, became very important to understand what is the new information that's coming out, what are their responses, how can we collaborate and do things together. In the first week, in terms of our working with the government and advocacy, it wasn't such a big part of our work. We tried and stayed in touch with the communities, mostly in order to reach out to the communities. How did we do the community contact? I think this is where the whole idea of low tech, no tech community comes into picture. Years and years of mobile creches, contact on the ground, and a strong community engagement program helped us. We went back to basic registers, handwritten records of telephone numbers, trying to call each family every day to make sure that we are able to track our families. Local shopkeepers, small suppliers rose to the occasion to supply food needs to the ground, and our community leaders, key parent group leaders, security guards, representatives of construction site owners who were on the site, they became our foot soldiers on the ground and really enabled us to reach the families. What did we actually do? To begin with, of course, our first contact through the telephone to these communities was to spread the awareness information about prevention and precaution, taking information from the Ministry of Health that produced information that UNICEF came out with in terms of ECD messages for children, trying to compile all of that in simple messages that can be delivered over the phone to these communities. A big part of our attention and efforts were on distributing food provisions on the ground. As on date, over the last 2 weeks, there are a little over 18,000 families that we are tracking on a daily basis in terms of food provisioning, making sure that families, particularly young children, have basic food to get by. Besides that, in the first 2 weeks, our focus has been on safety, care and protection, and also just making sure that there is minimum health support available to these communities on the ground. Of course, government has been constantly on the go in terms of announcing new benefits and entitlements for people from the marginal communities, and we've been trying to keep a track of these announcements to simplify the information and make sure that our people are aware of what is out there available for them. Collaborations, as I said, was a big part. And how did this help? This was the time to reach out to friends from government, from networks, from civil society organizations and industries. Our ear to the ground made sure that we were alerting government agencies constantly about the hunger spots, linking communities to community kitchens and other kinds of food provisioning that the government was doing. We really relied on our community leaders to keep a track on violence within communities, within families, keep track of immunization schedules for children, and making sure that we are able to support pregnant women remotely and their linkages to the government. And all this was because of on-ground support. And as you can, I don't know if you can spot in the pictures, we also took support of local policemen and school principals in helping in food distribution in many communities. And also this was a time to keep asking people, sharing and learning from their experiences, and also sharing our experiences with many other civil society partners of how we were going about it. Advocacy, as Sheldon mentioned also, at our understanding was that the basic thrust of advocacy through networks and other forums was on basic survival and sustenance. Women and children, especially young children, were mostly invisible in any kind of relief measures, or they were more welfare-ish announcements made by the government. Childcare and the need for childcare, even in these difficult times, was completely absent in the first 2 weeks and continues to remain absent even now. The other big gap that we understood through our advocacy, through forums and networks, has also been about the frontline workers. Is it now time to recognize frontline workers such as Anganwadi workers as essential workers? What about their protection, social security measures, and how do we support even childcare needs for our frontline workers when they're out there fighting this pandemic on behalf of all of us? So that's broadly what we've been able to do over the last 2 weeks since the lockdown was announced. I must pause here to share a word about Mobile Cresh's internal response mechanism. A group of 120, all feet off the ground, everybody works from home, but all hands on the deck. Each member of the organization is involved in making sure that we are able to reach the last child, the last family, in making sure food, nutrition, health, care, and protection services are available to them. Also, during this period, just making sure that the internal team feels motivated, they have access to technology, access to internet and mobile phone to do all of this, and recognizing and appreciating their efforts throughout this period remotely has been an internal system that we've adopted. Going forward, very quickly, things are changing very rapidly. So what do we plan to do? I think our triangle gets inverted to a straight triangle over the next 1 week, where we'll focus on a rapid assessment to make sure or understand, are the benefits really reaching people, what government has announced, and come back to the government and other decision makers with facts from the ground as to how is the ground situation really panning out through the lens of young children and women and their families. The other big thing that I think is going to take away a lot of our energy and focus is the post-lockdown planning. How is this pandemic going to change the world, especially for migrant workers and therefore their young children? And so what can we as organizations, networks, and forums and individuals do differently and do better in terms of the long-term rehabilitation planning? Of course, behind all of it, our continuous contact with families will remain. But moving forward, now that there is some food security, this is the time to talk about learning and stimulation. So we've now come out with a whole package of no tech learning stimulation activities, everything through the phone by our frontline workers to our communities. We are also very mindful that people have already lost money and may not see any money coming to their pockets. So even a phone top up to have access to that phone might be a difficulty. Forget smartphones and forget digital media. So we're very mindful of these challenges and trying to make sure what we can do using just remotely phone and small community groups to provide for early stimulation and care and protection activities on the ground. Of course, looking forward, I think it's important that we remain responsible to stay alive and healthy ourselves so that we have a story to tell for the next generation. So to all of you, stay healthy, stay safe, stay distant, but stay connected. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sumitra. It gives us a clear picture of the impact of this situation to our migrant families and their young children. And of course, thank you for sharing what you have been doing, and please continue to share even after this webinar, and we will stay alive. All right, so the last presentation would be from our colleagues from Save the Children Philippines, Ms. Joy Sampang and Ms. Catherine Manzano. They will be sharing with us how they made use of a parenting application intended to reach parents and caregivers of 0 to 6 years old children, especially those residing in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. Over to you, Joy. Joy first. All right.
Yes.
Please be mindful of the time as we're a little bit, behind of our schedule. Just a few minutes. Thank you, Joy.
Okay, thank you everyone for this opportunity to share each other's work for young children. I will be joined later by my colleague Catherine to talk about our mobile application. Next slide, please, Andrea. Just a quick background of our organization. Save the Children has been working in the Philippines for more than 4 decades, and we continue to contribute to our 3 global breakthroughs for children: survive, learn, and be protected. Our ECCD program ensures the continuum of services from 0 to 8 years old. All projects were about to move forward with implementation when this outbreak disrupted our ways of working. When WHO declared the COVID-19 a pandemic, the Philippine government responded by declaring a state of calamity throughout the country. So from March 16 until April 30, the entire Luzon, including Manila, an island group of over 50 million people, has been placed under enhanced community quarantine to control the spread of the disease. Other government units in Visayas and Mindanao have also declared total lockdown. As of April 9, the Philippines ranked 10th in the countries with COVID-19 infections in Asia. Next slide, please. So just like what Sumitra did in India, Save the Children Philippines also conducted a series of consultations to different stakeholders like government representatives, service providers, community volunteers, families, and children in our program areas. We use various platforms to such as Facebook, Messenger, SMS, and phone calls following social distancing and other government measures. We strongly recognize children's right to be heard and to freely express their views in matters affecting them. Let's now look at the status of Filipino children in conjunction of the Nurturing Care Framework. I will build on to Sheldon's earlier discussion. The COVID-19 has truly changed family life. Disadvantaged families and children living in crowded spaces in urban and those from hard to reach communities are the ones hardest hit. As the pandemic shuts down preschools, a range of services, workplaces, and public transportation, it is impacting not only the physical health of families with young children, but also threatening their economic and emotional well being. This has worsened in remote areas with little to no access of services. So even before the COVID-19. So this crisis occurs during a time when children's rapid brain development and they are particularly affected by the rising stress of the adults who care for them. Examples of persistent stress are parental emotional instability, making them less engaged. It can also be domestic or community violence because of lack of social protection in place, or even food insecurity. Such stress may hamper children's brain development. Based on our consultations, young children are worried if their family will still have food to eat. They are sad or frustrated that they cannot play outdoors with their friends. Next slide, please. So we will adhere to our global guidance and contribute to the reduction of COVID-19 infection and delay its transmission in our areas, and also mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on children's learning, health, and protection, our three global breakthroughs. So we will do this by adopting all ongoing ECD programs to integrate mitigation and response strategies on COVID-19. Anchored on the do no harm principle, we are working on 5 areas, but I will only focus on education as our anchor for an integrated program. We prioritize the continuity of children's learning at home through online and other media platforms during this transition period and until their safe return to school. We will leverage on our existing context-specific holistic programs and prioritize adding psychosocial support to parents and other caregivers so that they will be able to process their own fears and be responsive to their children. We also started sharing tips for parents on social media and radio programs. Our aim is to ensure children have positive experiences from their loving, safe, and playful caregivers, which is critical during this crisis. Gender, disability, and resilience are at the center of our response plan as we work towards an integrated approach of programming. I will stop there and I will turn you over to Catherine, who will discuss more about our iMulat mobile application.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I just want to say first, before I start with my presentation, that what I will be discussing is about the technology that has been laid out before the onset of the pandemic. I will be discussing how this application or this technology can be pivoted in order for it to be used in the response during this time. So the eMulat app, Mulat in Tagalog means to open one's eyes, to educate, or to nurture. It is a parenting application developed by Save the Children Philippines for caregivers of children 0 to 6 years old. So this was launched in 2018. The app has been primarily promoted as a supplement to the face-to-face parenting education sessions carried out by the First Read Project in Metro Manila and South Central Mindanao. So this also include materials from both the First Read Project, which is an ECD project, and the sponsorship project of Save the Children here in the Philippines. So next slide, please. Some of the key features of this application include the key messages, which are condensed versions of the parenting education module. It also includes key messages from the ELM at home being used by the sponsorship program. There are also videos, how-to videos, and this reinforces the key messages being showing how caregivers can do the activities with their children. So there's also a quiz feature in the app. This allows caregivers to check their comprehension of the lessons. And this is also a way for the project to monitor change in knowledge of the app users. However, given it must be noted that the data in relation to the quiz requires an internet access in order for the data to be sent over to a server where the project can retrieve it and for the data to be analyzed. But given the situation of the caregivers who are the primary target of the app, as well as the overall infrastructure in the country, that particular feature of the app hasn't been fully utilized yet. We are currently looking for ways on how to address this challenge. And one of the things that we are exploring is the possibility of a partnership with telcos, local telcos, to provide free data service similar to what they have done for Facebook in the country. So another key feature of the app is a calendar log, which allows caregivers to track their engagement with the children. They can note the books that they have read, the games that they have played, the different activities that they have done together. It is a way for the parents to see how they have progress in terms of interacting with their children. They can also take down of their observations of their children as they go along the way. Next slide. So as I've mentioned earlier, this is something that has been laid out before the onset of the pandemic. So, and we'll just be discussing how it can be tweaked. And because it takes a long time for an app to be developed. So first we did the feasibility study. It was conducted actually a year prior to the start of the app development because we want to validate if an app is really the most suitable mode of delivery for the areas where the project is being implemented. This also allowed us to determine the possible reach of the app in the country, if we can scale it up or it will just remain within the areas where we were working at that time. So the project then solicited the help of a third party. The consultant was tasked with wireframing, basically designing the user interface in general. So one of the key things that must be done is the conversion of the materials for the app, specifically because we wanted the videos to be available offline. So beta testing is another crucial step because this is where you look for bugs and you fix the bugs before you actually do the revisions. And the last one is uploading the app to the Play Store. Next slide. So ways on how we were able to reach the most deprived families despite challenges in connectivity. First is deciding on an Android-based application because most of the target users do not have iOS. They have Android-based applications. So we also limited the size of the application because that is storage is one of the main reasons why people have they hesitate to download applications. So, and of course, ensuring the availability of the contents offline is also one thing. So provision of internet connections, we did that for the communities where we worked in. We brought in mobile internet connections and we did some downloading days. Of course, during this time, it's not a possibility, but we have what we call P2P sharing applications. We can use that at this time to further disseminate the application, provided that we already have like volunteers who are already doing rounds on the ground and they can actually use the P2P sharing application to provide the app to the parents. Now, Imulat and COVID-19, we are promoting Imulat to caregivers as a resource pack of activities that they can do with their children while on lockdown or community quarantine. So constant communication with the community is also important. So we are utilizing the volunteers that we have on the ground. So the app, moving forward, the app can also have a chat option for caregivers to ask questions, clarifications, and provide comments and suggestions. So additional resources on COVID-19 can also be included in the application, such as key messages, videos that they can show to their children about washing their hands, why social distancing is important, stuff like that. So we can also enlist ECCD facilitators to provide follow-up support. For now, since we don't have those features yet in the application, we are actually relying on social media, chat groups that we have on Facebook, so that we can check with our volunteers, our facilitators, on how they are actually engaging with the parents. And right now, the data that we are getting from them is that there's really a need for parents to be updated with the different activities that they can do with their children while they are on lockdown. And we all know that the stress of a child can actually be reduced if there is a semblance of normality in their lives. And one such thing is for them to be able to do the things that they used to do before the lockdown, especially if they are already going to centers or schools. So activities such as those will really be helpful. So I'll stop there, minding the time. So Evelyn.
Thank you, Joy and Catherine, for that very interesting presentation. It's good to know that it can actually be accessed online, and offline. So for the next 10 minutes, we will be responding to the questions you've raised in the chat box, and also those questions that came in as part of the presentation of the registration, sorry. So if I can please request all the presenters to turn on their videos, please. Okay, I have a question here which I got, from the registration list. This one is for Yvonne. Yvonne, if you can respond to this question. How do you support parents of young children with special needs or disabilities, including those with autism? How can we build resilience among children with special needs to overcome anxiety caused by COVID-19? If you can, answer that question, Yvonne.
I think I mentioned some of the things. I think the support for parents is important, and that means not pushing them to the limit. They're not going to be therapists, they're not going to be teachers. They're trying their very best in the circumstances. And so just to support them and say, and with concrete activities as well, and say to them, here's something we want you to do on a daily basis. It takes 10 minutes, make it short, make it simple, concrete, and encourage them to do it, and don't make it punitive if they don't manage, right? You didn't manage, that's okay, try again. So this constant support, I think, is really, really important. And on the topic of resilience, that's huge. That has to, that everything comes together. Can I maybe just point to a really good website that gives sort of some concrete ideas? I like the one Beyond Blue. That's from Australia. It's beyondblue.org.au, and they have a special, first of all, it's for adults and children, but they have a special section for children, and they have a special section now for the COVID-19 response, and it includes resilience building as well. But I think one hot tip is that the parents or adults keep their own anxieties under control, keep it to a minimum. They're role models for the young children, including special needs kids, and just give age-appropriate explanations, stay calm, and allow ventilation of feelings. Let the children, say, oh, I'm worried. Will something happen to my family? I think, and then truthfully answer and say, no, we're doing our best, and staying positive in the answers, I think, has a lot to do with the resilience building in these times.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I also would like to note that there are a lot of resources that we have posted in our website. And one of those resources actually looked at how do you actually speak to children, how do you explain COVID-19 to them. Plus, we also have, some of our institutional members, if I may just mention Early Start. In Early Start Australia, they also have a lot of good resources in terms of listening to children. How do you help them cope with stress? And that would actually be one of the webinars that we will be also running in the next few weeks. Let's take some questions from the chat box. There are still 14 questions which are open. If I can take Sheldon, there's something on the curriculum. I think there's a question in terms of how do you actually change or make some modifications in the curriculum, speaking to, I think, to the presentation, the point you made earlier.
Part of it has to do with to what extent you'll use the curriculum to try to make up for this lost time, and to what extent the curriculum, mastery of the curriculum will be expected of people. One change has been not only school closures and school opening dates, but also examinations have been canceled or postponed, and that obviously has an impact on assessing mastery of a curriculum. I think one issue in terms of a curriculum for early childhood programs, and someone raised the issue about what you do with parents who aren't literate and can't read and write, is to ensure that there's a lot in any kind of curriculum, which is talking about play for education purposes, social interaction, physical exercise, also linked, I think, to the ability of families, even not literate parents, to actually use reading books, illustrated books, to tell stories. Just one other brief point is this question about fathers and the role of fathers. No one I've seen, none of the material I've seen looks at the role of the fathers in this whole process. And many, many millions of fathers are back home who have not been home. And what is their role? What could it be? What should it be? And what is it now? I think is important to look at.
Thank you, Sheldon. We have another question for Sumitra. Sumitra, if I can read out a question which came from the registration. How do we help children living in slums with semi-literate parents stuck at home in crowded homes with no learning resources and with no internet connection? Are there any more practical tips that you can provide based on your experience?
So as I mentioned, Evelyn, I'm going to build on what Yvonne mentioned and Sheldon. At the moment, families are really trying to cope with the crisis of survival. It is important to listen to them and to respond to their immediate and urgent needs for food, for health, for their rent, and for their income security. And these are mostly families who are semi-literate, neo-literate families who have very little resources. What at Mobile Creches we have done is exactly what Sheldon mentioned, that rely very little on print and use your mother tongue, use folk song music, games that you would normally play in the home using your own body and using very little resources, and looking at it through an age appropriate development lens and suggesting it to families. Over the last 1 week or so, we've been able to do this through the phone, and we've been able to record some of these stories and poems to send it to them to download once so that they don't need to use the internet again and again. But now we also realize that the coming week is going to be harder, because whatever little resources people had, they're running out of those resources. The lockdown seems to continue. Work is not going to come so soon. So if they have a little money, they may not use that to top up their phones, which means that the one last means that we had to reach to families remotely might also get lost. So what we're trying to do is also look at small communities and key leaders within those slums and construction sites to also pass on these age appropriate care and stimulation activities to them, so that in case we're not able to reach directly to families, we at least reach them through these community people who are on the ground in their neighborhood.
Thank you, Sumitra. I have another question for Joy or Catherine. Has there been any evaluation on the iMulat application, and is this something that can actually be replicated to other countries?
I actually did answer that via chat, but to share
sorry.
with everyone else, what we actually did was an assessment of the user interface, the key features, as well as look into how the target audience has been using the application. But as to the effectivity of the key messages being delivered via app, we haven't done that yet. So the reason for the assessment that we did a few last year was to determine how we can improve the app further so that it will be more enticing for the parents to use on a more regular basis. And that resulted to the newer version that is currently uploaded in the Google Play Store. If there are no restrictions on the country where you are accessing the Google Play Store, you will be able to download it. So the key messages, the quizzes, they are available in both Filipino and English. However, the videos, the how-to videos, are currently only available in Filipino.
Just to add, based on our experience, many of our healthcare workers are also using the app to disseminate the information on parenting, on positive parenting, and the like. So it can be used by our health workers in the communities.
Thank Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Catherine. There's also a set of questions related to ECD workforce, and I think Sumitra alluded to it to this as well in her presentation. Can someone take this question? Maybe short, answer to that. Maybe Sheldon, Sumitra, Yvonne, in terms of how do we take care of the ECD workforce? Some of them have actually stopped, their because they don't work now. Payment has been delayed or even stopped. Some have less IT skills. How do we any insights in terms of how do we also protect our ECD workforce? Can we begin with Sumitra and then Sheldon?
Sure, Evelyn. I think it's been very interesting. The ECD workforce within mobile crashes. Over the last 3 weeks, we've seen phenomenal embracing of technology. Many of our frontline crash workers who did not use WhatsApp, who didn't know how to click a picture and upload the picture through WhatsApp to other groups, are now beginning to use it remotely by help from colleagues, but also their own children and family members are helping it. So in a way, it's also acting as an intrinsic motivation for them to be able to reach out and do this work. But this is not about the frontline workers with organizations like Mobile Crushes. This is about the larger question of ECD workforce out there who do not have this kind of support. And especially in the government system where Anganwadi workers are out there and have to do certain functions around health, nutrition, even during this time. This just calls for a far greater and stronger call to action to recognize them as professional workers, to secure their wages, to enable social security. If one thing the pandemic must teach us to do better, it is post-pandemic recognize the frontline workers, and that includes the ECD workers.
Sheldon?
Yes, just to add one thing. From a more global perspective, schools will reopen, ECD programs will reopen, businesses will reopen, and governments will claim victory. Okay, but in fact, the longer lasting impact, especially on the poor and the disadvantaged, the small enterprises will be rescued, but the vendor with his kiosk will not be, or her kiosk will simply disappear. The schools will continue because they're mainly governmental, and the teachers who might temporarily be losing a salary will get it back. The ECD workers who are more private and community based maybe won't. And so the differentiated impact on formal schooling versus ECD programs, on the relatively wealthy versus the more disadvantaged, governments have to be forced to look on that and not too early on say, well, all right, we're back to where we started, because we won't be back to where we started in ECD and with disparities for years. And many of the gains made over the last 10, 20 years in terms of early childhood, gender equity are now being lost. And how do we get them back is going to be the important issue.
Thank you, Sheldon. And that is the last question that we can take for the moment, but rest assured that we have actually noted your questions, and again we'll be considering them as we design the other webinars that we will be having. So thank you to all our presenters and to all our attendees. Can we give a round of applause to all our presenters? All right. I need the last 3 minutes. I just want to provide some updates in terms of how we intend to respond, in ARNEC in terms of the different initiatives, that we have lined up for you. So just very quickly. Okay, yeah. So we've been collating and sharing resources in our website and also in our social media. I hope you find those resources useful. And if there are resources that you think we should be able to provide to you for as useful in terms of your needs in the countries, please let us know. We will also have a rapid assessment on the situation of young children and their families. It's going to be a quick survey to be disseminated to the whole ECD regional ECD community. I hope you participate on that one. We also have a series of webinars featuring country experiences, strategies, and approaches. And you will see there a lineup of the different topics that we would be covering. Please, if you see that an important topic or issue that we need to cover is not there, let us know. But we will be looking at psychosocial support to parents and caregivers, how children cope with stress and fear, distance learning approaches, supporting the ECD workforce, child protection and domestic violence, and of course, the results of the survey we will be providing to you as well. We will be establishing communities of practice, learning groups to facilitate collaboration and learning across countries. Beyond this webinar, we will, really engage other countries so the collaboration continues and the learning continues. Lastly, the documentation and development of some case studies is very important. So based on the country experiences, approaches, and strategies that you are sharing with us in this webinar and in other platforms, we will do a bit of documentation on that one. Finally, we appreciate receiving your feedback on this webinar so we can improve on the next ones, and we will send you a short evaluation form, and hope you can respond to it to this form very quickly, as this will also determine the impact of webinars as a form of knowledge management and learning. With that, we are closing the webinar. Again, thank you so much to all our presenters and our attendees. Until next time, thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.